Maria Elena Rodriguez had grown accustomed to the stairs. At 28, she carried herself with quiet dignity through the bustling streets of downtown Phoenix, her long sleeves carefully pulled down to cover the intricate network of scars that decorated her arms like a roadmap of survival. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, but she never rolled up her sleeves, never allowed the world to see what lay beneath the fabric. Working as a night shift cleaner at the Maricopa County Superior Court building, Maria had found solace in the empty hallways and silent courtrooms. The work was honest, and, more importantly, it allowed her to avoid the curious glances and whispered conversations that seemed to follow her everywhere else. Her supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, had been kind enough to overlook the fact that Maria always wore long sleeves, even during the scorching summer months when temperatures soared above 110 degrees. The scars told a story that Maria had spent years trying to forget. They weren't the result of self-harm or accidents, as many people assumed when they caught glimpses of the raised, deliberate patterns on her skin. Instead, they were evidence of a childhood nightmare that had lasted far too long, inflicted by people who should have protected her. The geometric designs carved into her arms and shoulders were the handiwork of a trafficking ring that had stolen her childhood and marked her as property when she was barely 12 years old. Maria had escaped that life 8 years ago, thanks to a raid conducted by federal agents and local police. But freedom had come with its own challenges. The physical scars had healed as much as they ever would, but the emotional wounds remained fresh. Therapy had helped, but the shame she felt about her appearance often overwhelmed any progress she made in healing. The other cleaning staff at the courthouse had initially been welcoming, but as the weeks turned into months, their attitude shifted. Maria noticed how conversations would stop when she entered a room, how her co-workers would exchange meaningful glances when they thought she wasn't looking. The whispers started small but grew louder with each passing day. "Have you seen her arms?" she heard Janet whisper to Carol one evening as they gathered their supplies from the storage closet. "There's something seriously wrong with that girl." "I heard she was in a gang," Carol replied, her voice barely audible but still loud enough for Maria to catch every word. "Those look like gang tattoos or something worse." "Whatever happened to her, she's trouble," added Mike, the lead custodian who had always been friendly until recently. "People don't get marks like that from normal situations." Maria pretended not to hear, focusing instead on organizing her cleaning cart with methodical precision. Each comment felt like a small cut, reopening wounds that had taken years to partially heal. She had worked so hard to build a normal life, to blend in and find peace in anonymity, but the scars made that impossible. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late September. Maria was cleaning the third-floor offices when she overheard a conversation between two security guards stationed near the elevator bank. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but their voices carried clearly through the empty hallway. "I'm telling you, Dave, there's something off about the new cleaning girl," said the younger guard, whose name tag read Thompson. "She gives me the creeps with those long sleeves and the way she skulks around here at night." "You think she's casing the place?" Dave responded, concern evident in his voice. "Maybe. Or worse. Those scars on her arms? I got a glimpse when she was reaching up to dust a high shelf last week. They're not natural, man. They look like some kind of ritual markings or gang identification. We should probably run a background check." Maria's blood ran cold. A background check would reveal her past, her time in the system, the years of therapy and rehabilitation. It would expose everything she had worked so hard to leave behind. She pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding as she listened to the guards discuss her fate. "I'll mention it to the supervisor tomorrow," Dave concluded. "Better safe than sorry, especially with all the sensitive documents and equipment in this building." That night, Maria barely slept. She stared at the ceiling of her small studio apartment, wondering if she would soon be unemployed again, forced to find another job where she could hide in the shadows and hope that no one would look too closely at the evidence of her past. The cycle seemed endless: find work, try to fit in, have people discover her scars, face suspicion and eventual rejection, then start over somewhere else. The next morning brought an unexpected turn of events. As Maria arrived for her evening shift, she found Mrs. Henderson waiting for her in the supply room with a grave expression on her face. "Maria, honey, we need to talk," the older woman said gently, her weathered hands folded in front of her. I've had some concerns raised about you by other staff members. Maria's stomach dropped. What kind of concerns, Mrs. Henderson? Well, it's about those scars you try so hard to hide. People are talking, making assumptions. Some folks think you might be involved in something dangerous or illegal. Mrs. Henderson's voice was kind but firm. I need you to help me understand what we're dealing with here. The moment Maria had dreaded for months had finally arrived. She could see the uncertainty in Mrs. Henderson's eyes, the way her supervisor maintained a careful distance as if afraid that Maria might pose some kind of threat. All the whispers and suspicious glances had culminated in this confrontation. I know how they look, Maria said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. But they're not what people think they are. Then, help me understand, dear. If you can explain what happened to you, maybe we can put these rumors to rest. Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had never told her story to anyone at work, had never revealed the truth about her past. The shame and fear of judgment had kept her silent for so long that she wasn't sure she could find the words even now. It's complicated, Mrs. Henderson. And it's not something I like to talk about. I understand that, honey, but I'm afraid I may not have a choice here. The security team has requested a full background investigation, and there's talk of involving the police. If you can't give me something to work with, my hands are going to be tied. The mention of police involvement sent a chill through Maria's body. While she had no criminal record and had done nothing wrong, the thought of uniformed officers questioning her about her scars brought back memories she had fought hard to suppress. Police had been part of her rescue, but they had also been the ones to ask painful questions and force her to relive traumatic experiences in the name of building a case against her captors. Please don't call the police, Maria pleaded, her composure finally cracking. I promise you, I'm not a threat to anyone. I just want to work and be left alone. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly, but concern remained etched on her face. Maria, if you're in some kind of trouble or danger, we want to help you. But I can't protect you if I don't know what I'm dealing with. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Officer Daniel Martinez, a community liaison officer who regularly patrolled the courthouse area. He appeared in the doorway of the supply room, his presence immediately commanding attention. Maria instinctively stepped backward, her hands moving to pull her sleeves down even though they were already covering her scars completely. Evening, Mrs. Henderson, Officer Martinez said with a professional nod. I heard there might be a situation here that requires police attention? Oh, Officer Martinez, I didn't expect you so soon, Mrs. Henderson replied, clearly flustered. We were just having a conversation about some concerns that have been raised. Officer Martinez's gaze shifted to Maria, and she felt herself shrinking under his scrutiny. He was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 30s, with kind eyes that seemed to take in everything about her appearance and demeanor. Unlike the security guards who had whispered about her in the hallways, there was no immediate suspicion or judgment in his expression. And you are, he asked Maria directly, his voice gentle but authoritative. Maria Rodriguez, she managed to say, her voice shaking slightly. Mrs. Henderson tells me there are some concerns about your background. Would you mind if we had a conversation about that? Maria felt trapped. The supply room suddenly seemed smaller, the walls closing in around her as she faced the possibility of having to reveal her deepest secrets to these virtual strangers. She had built her entire adult life around avoiding exactly this kind of situation. I haven't done anything wrong, she said, the words coming out more defensively than she had intended. I'm not suggesting that you have, Officer Martinez replied calmly. But I understand there are some questions about some scarring that has made people uncomfortable. Sometimes these things can be cleared up pretty easily with just a simple explanation. The irony wasn't lost on Maria. A simple explanation was exactly what she couldn't provide. There was nothing simple about human trafficking, about being branded like livestock, about spending years believing that she was worthless and deserving of whatever pain was inflicted upon her. There was nothing simple about the long road to recovery or the daily struggle to see herself as more than just a collection of scars and traumatic memories. It's not that simple, she said finally. Officer Martinez studied her face for a moment, and Maria wondered what he was seeing. Did he notice the way her hands trembled slightly? Could he see the fear in her eyes, or did he simply see another potentially dangerous individual who needed to be investigated and processed? Okay, he said after a pause. Why don't we start with something easier? How long have you been working here? 3 months, Maria answered. And, before that? Different cleaning jobs. Mostly night shifts. Always cleaning work? Maria nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. Officer Martinez glanced at Mrs. Henderson, who was watching the exchange with growing concern. It was clear that the supervisor cared about Maria and didn't want to see her hurt, but she also had a responsibility to ensure the safety and security of the courthouse. Maria, Officer Martinez said, turning his attention back to her, I get the feeling that you've had some difficult experiences in your past. Sometimes those experiences leave marks, both visible and invisible. If that's the case, I want you to know that you're not in trouble here. But I also need to understand what we're dealing with so I can help put people's concerns to rest. His words were kind, but Maria could hear the underlying message. She was going to have to reveal her scars and explain their origin, or she was going to lose her job and possibly face further investigation. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. She looked around the small room, at Mrs. Henderson's worried face and Officer Martinez's patient but determined expression. These people held her fate in their hands, and she realized that her years of hiding and silence had brought her to this inevitable moment of reckoning. Taking a deep breath, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She slowly began to roll up the sleeve of her left arm, revealing the first glimpse of the intricate scarification that covered her skin. The geometric patterns and symbols that had been carved into her flesh years ago were clearly visible in the fluorescent lighting of the supply room. Mrs. Henderson gasped softly, her hand moving to cover her mouth in shock. But it was Officer Martinez's reaction that surprised Maria most. Instead of the disgust or suspicion she had expected to see, his expression transformed into something she couldn't quite identify. His eyes widened, and his face went pale as he stared at the revealed scarring. "Dear God," he whispered, his professional composure cracking for the first time since he had entered the room. Maria quickly pulled her sleeve back down, shame flooding through her as she realized that even a police officer found her scars disturbing. But Officer Martinez's next words stopped her cold. "Those aren't gang markings," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of horror and recognition. "Those are trafficking brands." The silence in the supply room was deafening. Officer Martinez's words hung in the air like a revelation that changed everything and nothing all at once. Maria felt her knees weaken as she realized that her carefully guarded secret had been exposed not through her own confession, but through the trained eye of someone who had clearly encountered similar horrors before. Mrs. Henderson looked confused, glancing between Maria and the officer as if she didn't quite understand what she was witnessing. "Trafficking brands," she repeated slowly. "What does that mean?" Officer Martinez never took his eyes off Maria as he answered. "It means that someone held this woman against her will and marked her body to show ownership. It's a practice used by human traffickers to identify their victims and prevent them from being taken by competing operations." Maria wrapped her arms around herself protectively, feeling exposed despite being fully clothed. The clinical way Officer Martinez explained her trauma made it feel surreal, as if he were describing something that had happened to someone else entirely. "How do you know about things like that?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I spent 2 years working with a federal task force focused on human trafficking investigations before transferring to community policing," Officer Martinez explained. "I've seen these patterns before, though never quite like these." He turned his attention back to Maria. The geometric designs, the placement, the precision of the cuts, this wasn't done by amateurs. Maria found herself nodding before she could stop herself. The people who had held her captive had indeed been professionals, part of a sophisticated operation that had been running for years before law enforcement finally shut them down. The scarification process had been performed by someone with medical training, ensuring that the marks would heal cleanly and remain visible for life. "Maria," Officer Martinez said gently, "I need you to know that you're safe now." Whatever happened to you before, you're not in any trouble here. But, I do need to ask you some questions, if you're willing to answer them. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her maternal instincts clearly activated. Maybe we should call someone for her? A lawyer or a counselor? I don't need a lawyer, Maria said quickly, fear creeping into her voice. I haven't done anything wrong. No one is saying you have, Officer Martinez assured her. Mrs. Henderson is just looking out for your welfare. These kinds of conversations can be difficult, and it's okay to have support if you need it. Maria shook her head. I just want to keep my job and be left alone. I don't want to talk about the past. I understand that, Officer Martinez said. And I want you to keep your job too. But, now that I know what those scars represent, I have certain obligations as a law enforcement officer. There are protocols I need to follow. The word protocols sent a chill through Maria's body. She remembered the endless interviews after her rescue, the forms and statements and court appearances that had stretched on for months. She had thought that part of her life was over, that she could finally move forward without constantly reliving her trauma for the benefit of the justice system. What kind of protocols, she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Well, first, I need to verify that you're not currently in any danger. Are you living freely? Do you have any contact with the people who hurt you? They're all in prison, Maria said quietly. The whole organization was shut down 8 years ago. Officer Martinez nodded. Good. That's good to hear. What about support services? Are you connected with any victim assistance programs? Maria hesitated. She had been part of various programs over the years, but she had gradually withdrawn from most of them as she tried to build a normal life. The constant reminders of her victim status had become more painful than helpful. I was, for a while. But I stopped going to most of the meetings and therapy sessions about 2 years ago. Why did you stop? The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. How could she explain that being constantly surrounded by other survivors had made it impossible to forget what had happened to her? How could she describe the way victim support groups had started to feel like another form of captivity, one where she was defined entirely by what had been done to her rather than who she wanted to become? Because I wanted to move on, she said finally. I wanted to be normal. Mrs. Henderson, who had been listening to the exchange with growing horror and sympathy, stepped closer to Maria. Honey, why didn't you tell me? If I had known what you'd been through, I never would have let people talk about you the way they have been. That's exactly why I didn't tell you, Maria replied. I didn't want to be treated differently. I didn't want to be the victim in the room that everyone feels sorry for. Officer Martinez was taking notes in a small notebook, but he looked up at her words. Maria, I need you to understand something. What happened to you wasn't your fault, and there's no shame in being a survivor. But I'm also hearing that you've isolated yourself from support systems, and that concerns me. I'm fine on my own, Maria insisted, though even she could hear the lack of conviction in her voice. Are you? Because from what I'm observing, you're living in fear. You're hiding from people who might actually want to help you, and you're working nights so you can avoid human contact during the day. That doesn't sound fine to me. His words stung because they were true. Maria had built her entire adult life around avoidance and isolation. She worked nights, lived alone, had no close friends, and kept her interactions with others to the absolute minimum necessary to function in society. She had told herself that this was healing, that this was moving on, but hearing it described so bluntly made her realize how limited her existence had become. It's better than being stared at and judged, she said defensively. Is it? Or is it just a different kind of prison? The question hit Maria like a physical blow. She had never thought of her self-imposed isolation in those terms, but Officer Martinez's comparison was uncomfortably accurate. She had escaped her captors only to build her own cage made of fear and shame. Mrs. Henderson was crying now, tears streaming down her face as the full impact of the situation became clear. Maria, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for what happened to you, and I'm sorry that we made you feel unwelcome here. You didn't know, Maria said, trying to comfort the older woman despite her own emotional turmoil. "That's not an excuse," Mrs. Henderson replied firmly. "I should have shut down the gossip the minute it started. I should have protected you better." Officer Martinez closed his notebook and looked directly at Maria. "Here's what's going to happen. First, I'm going to talk to the security team and the other staff members. I'm going to explain that you've been cleared of any suspicion and that the rumors need to stop immediately. Second, I'm going to connect you with updated victim services resources, whether you think you need them or not." "I don't want special treatment," Maria protested. "This isn't special treatment. This is basic human decency and proper protocol for trafficking survivors. You deserve support, and you deserve to feel safe in your workplace." Maria felt overwhelmed by the rapid turn of events. In the space of 30 minutes, her carefully constructed facade had crumbled completely. The secret she had guarded so fiercely was now known by her supervisor and a police officer, and apparently there would be more people involved soon. What happens if people find out? What if everyone knows what happened to me? "That's not going to happen," Officer Martinez said firmly. "I can explain that you've been cleared without going into specifics about your past. Your privacy will be protected as much as possible." Mrs. Henderson wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. "And anyone who has a problem with that can deal with me directly. Maria, you have my word that you'll be treated with respect in this building from now on." Despite her fear and anxiety, Maria felt a small spark of hope. For the first time in months, she wasn't facing this challenge alone. These two people, who had been strangers to her trauma an hour ago, were now standing between her and the judgment of others. "There's something else," Officer Martinez said, his voice taking on a more official tone. "I need to ask you about the specific organization that held you. The patterns on your scars are very distinctive, and they might be connected to cases we're still working on." Maria's blood ran cold. "I thought you said they were all in prison." "The people directly responsible for what happened to you are in prison. But trafficking networks are complex, and sometimes there are connections between different operations that we don't discover until years later. I need to know if you'd be willing to look at some photographs and case files." The thought of looking at images and documents related to human trafficking made Maria feel sick to her stomach. She had spent years trying to forget the faces of her captors and the details of their operation. The idea of voluntarily exposing herself to similar material was terrifying. "I don't think I can do that," she said, her voice shaking. "I understand your reluctance, but this could be important. There have been some recent arrests in trafficking cases where we've seen similar scarification patterns. If there's a connection, it could help us save other people who are going through what you went through." The appeal to help other victims was both compelling and devastating. Maria knew better than anyone what those people were experiencing, and the thought that she might be able to help them was almost impossible to ignore. But she also knew that cooperating with law enforcement would mean reopening wounds that had taken years to partially heal. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course. But I do need an answer relatively soon. These investigations are time-sensitive." Mrs. Henderson had been listening to the exchange with growing understanding of the weight Maria had been carrying. "Whatever you decide, you'll have our support," she said. "And you don't have to face any of this alone." Officer Martinez handed Maria his business card. "My direct number is on there. If you have any problems at work, any concerns about your safety, or if you just need someone to talk to who understands this world, please call me." Maria took the card with trembling fingers. It had been years since anyone in law enforcement had shown her such kindness and respect. During the original investigation into her trafficking case, she had often felt more like evidence than a person. The detectives and prosecutors had been professional but distant, focused on building their case rather than on her well-being as an individual. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you go back to work if you feel up to it," Officer Martinez said. "I'll handle the conversations with security and staff. Mrs. Henderson will make sure you're protected from any further harassment. And you'll think about whether you're willing to help with our ongoing investigations. And if I say no to helping with the investigations? Then, you say no, and that's the end of it. You don't owe law enforcement anything beyond what you've already given. Your safety and well-being come first. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the supply room door. Janet, one of the cleaning staff members who had been among the most vocal in her suspicions about Maria, stood in the doorway looking confused and slightly frightened by the presence of a police officer. "Mrs. Henderson? Is everything okay? We heard there was some kind of situation." Mrs. Henderson's expression hardened as she looked at Janet. "Everything is fine. Maria has been completely cleared of any suspicion, and I expect that to be communicated to the rest of the staff immediately." "Cleared of what suspicion?" Janet asked, clearly fishing for more information. "That's not your concern," Mrs. Henderson replied sharply. "What is your concern is treating your co-worker with respect and keeping your opinions about her to yourself." Janet's face flushed red as she realized she was being scolded. "I was just concerned about security." "Your concerns have been addressed," Officer Martinez interjected, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "Ms. Rodriguez poses no threat to anyone in this building, and I expect her to be treated accordingly." After Janet left, looking confused and slightly ashamed, Officer Martinez turned back to Maria. "You see? People are going to accept the explanation that you've been cleared, and they're going to move on. Most of them were probably just concerned, not malicious." Maria wasn't entirely convinced, but she appreciated his optimism. She had experienced enough judgment and rejection to know that people's attitudes didn't always change simply because an authority figure told them to change. But perhaps it was enough to start with. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate for the magnitude of what these two people had just done for her. "Don't thank us yet," Officer Martinez said with a slight smile. "Thank us when you're feeling comfortable and safe here, when you can come to work without hiding from everyone around you." As the evening wore on and Maria returned to her cleaning duties, she found that the courthouse felt different. The shadows seemed less threatening, and the empty hallways felt more like refuge and less like isolation. Mrs. Henderson had already spoken to several staff members, and, while Maria still received some curious glances, they seemed less suspicious and more respectful. But the most significant change was internal. For the first time in years, Maria felt like she had allies. People who knew her secret and chose to stand with her rather than against her. It was a small beginning, but it was something she could build on. The question of whether to help with the ongoing trafficking investigations still weighed heavily on her mind. The idea of looking at case files and photographs terrified her, but the possibility of helping other victims pulled at her conscience. As she worked through the night, cleaning courtrooms where justice was supposedly served every day, she wondered if she had an obligation to use her experience to help ensure that justice reached more people. Officer Martinez had left his card on her cleaning cart, and, throughout the night, Maria found herself looking at it. The decision ahead of her would determine not just her level of involvement with law enforcement, but also her relationship with her own past. She could continue trying to forget and move on, or she could find a way to transform her trauma into something useful for others. By dawn, as her shift ended and she prepared to go home to her small apartment, Maria had made her decision. Maria sat in her car in the courthouse parking garage for 20 minutes after her shift ended, staring at Officer Martinez's business card. The morning sun was beginning to filter through the concrete structure, casting long shadows that reminded her of the bars that had once confined her. But, this time, she held the key to her own cage. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number before she could change her mind. "Martinez," came the crisp answer after 2 rings. "It's Maria Rodriguez. I want to help." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" "There's no pressure here, Maria. You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with." "I'm not comfortable with any of it," Maria replied honestly. "But I keep thinking about other people who might be going through what I went through. If I can help stop that, then I need to try." "Okay. Can you meet me at the station this afternoon? Around 2 o'clock? Maria's stomach clenched at the thought of walking into a police station voluntarily. Every interaction she'd had with law enforcement since her rescue had been mandatory, part of court proceedings or victim services requirements. Choosing to walk through those doors would be different.
Yes. I'll be there. Maria? Thank you.
What you're doing takes real courage. After she hung up, Maria drove home through the awakening city, watching ordinary people start their ordinary days. She envied their normalcy, their ability to worry about traffic and deadlines and mundane problems. But she also realized that for the first time in years, she was about to do something that might matter beyond her own survival. Her apartment was a study in minimalism and security. The locks on her door were heavy-duty, the windows had reinforced glass, and she had positioned her furniture so that she always had a clear view of both the entrance and her emergency exit route. These precautions had become so automatic that she barely noticed them anymore, but, as she prepared for her afternoon meeting, she wondered if other survivors would recognize the signs of someone still living in fear. Maria tried to sleep but found herself staring at the ceiling instead. Images from her past kept intruding, memories she had worked hard to suppress bubbling to the surface. The facility where she had been held, the faces of the other girls who had shared her captivity, the methodical way her captors had branded each of them with those distinctive geometric patterns. She remembered the day of the raid that had freed her. The chaos of shouting voices and flashing lights, the way the heavily armed officers had moved through the building like a force of nature. She remembered being terrified even as she was being rescued, unsure whether these new uniformed strangers would treat her better than her captors had. Officer Martinez had been different from the investigators who had questioned her 8 years ago. There had been a gentleness in his approach, a recognition of her humanity that had been often missing from those earlier encounters. But she still wasn't sure what to expect when she walked into that police station. At 1:30, Maria forced herself to get dressed and drive to the downtown Phoenix Police Department. The building was imposing, all glass and concrete and official importance. She sat in the visitor parking lot for several minutes, watching uniformed officers and suited detectives walk in and out of the building with purpose and authority. When she finally worked up the courage to go inside, she was surprised by how normal the reception area looked. It could have been the lobby of any office building, with comfortable chairs and informational brochures and a receptionist who smiled warmly as she approached. "I'm here to see Officer Martinez," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper.
"Of course. He's expecting you. Let me get him for you." Within minutes, Officer Martinez appeared, wearing civilian clothes instead of his uniform. Maria realized she had never seen him without the official police regalia, and his casual appearance made him seem more approachable. "Maria, thank you for coming. How are you feeling?" "Nervous," she admitted. "That's completely understandable. Let's go up to my office where we can talk privately." They rode the elevator in silence, Maria trying to calm her racing heart. Officer Martinez's office was small but comfortable, with family photos on the desk and certificates on the walls that spoke of specialized training in victim services and trauma response. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Water?" "Water would be good." As he handed her a bottle of water, Officer Martinez settled into his chair and opened a thick file folder. "Before we look at anything, I want you to understand exactly what we're dealing with here. Over the past 6 months, we've arrested 3 separate individuals in trafficking-related cases. Each of them had victims with scarification patterns similar to yours." Maria's hand instinctively moved to cover her sleeve-hidden scars. "Similar how?" "The geometric designs, the specific placement, the precision of the cutting. It's distinctive enough that we think there might be a connection to the organization that held you." "But, you said they were all in prison." "The leadership and most of the operations were shut down, yes. But trafficking networks sometimes have cells that operate independently. It's possible that someone trained in the same scarification techniques is still active." The implications hit Maria like a physical blow. If people trained by her former captors were still out there, still marking victims, then everything she had been through might be happening to others right now. "What do you need me to do?" Officer Martinez pulled out a series of photographs and laid them face down on the desk between them.
These are photos of scarification patterns from recent cases. I need you to look at them and tell me if you recognize the style or if they remind you of anything from your experience. Are there pictures of people in these photos?
No.
Just close-ups of the scarring.
No faces.
Maria nodded, grateful for that small mercy.
Okay. I'm ready.
The first photograph showed a pattern of interlocking triangles carved into someone's shoulder blade. Maria recognized it immediately. It was one of the basic designs used to mark new arrivals in the facility where she had been held. The memory of watching that pattern being cut into another girl's skin made her stomach turn.
I've seen this one, she said quietly. Officer Martinez made a note.
Where? It was used on new girls. When someone was brought in for the first time, this was usually their first mark.
What did it signify?
Maria struggled to find clinical words for the brutal system that had governed her captive life. It meant you belonged to the organization but hadn't been assigned to a specific handler yet.
Like inventory that hadn't been sorted. The second photograph showed a more complex pattern, interwoven circles with small lines extending from each intersection.
This one was harder for Maria to look at because she had one very similar on her own arm.
This one too, she said, pointing to the photo. This was used to show status within the organization.
What kind of status? Maria's face burned with shame as she forced herself to explain.
It meant you were compliant.
That you wouldn't try to escape or cause trouble. They used it as a reward system. Officer Martinez was writing everything down, but Maria could see the tightness around his eyes that suggested he was struggling to maintain his professional composure. She wondered how many of these cases he had worked, how many survivors he had interviewed, and whether it ever got easier to hear these stories. The third photograph was one she didn't recognize, a spiral design with hash marks along the edges. She studied it carefully, trying to remember if she had ever seen anything similar during her captivity. I don't think this one is from the same people, she said finally.
What makes you say that? The cutting style is different. The people who held me were very precise, almost surgical in their technique. This looks more rough, like it was done by someone less skilled. Officer Martinez made another note and moved to the fourth photograph.
This one made Maria gasp audibly. It was an exact replica of one of the marks on her own body, down to the smallest detail.
Where did this come from? She asked, her voice shaking.
A victim we rescued 3 weeks ago from a house in Scottsdale. She's about your age, held for approximately 4 years.
The room seemed to spin around Maria as the implications sank in.
Someone had been using the exact same techniques, the exact same designs, that had been used on her 8 years ago.
The organization she thought had been completely destroyed was still operating in some form. Is she okay? The victim from Scottsdale?
She's alive, but she's in rough shape.
Both physically and emotionally. She's been mostly nonverbal since the rescue. Maria understood that response all too well.
She remembered her own first weeks of freedom, when speaking had felt impossible and every human interaction had been terrifying. The idea that someone else was going through that same struggle right now because the same people who had hurt her were still active filled her with a mixture of rage and determination. I want to talk to her, Maria said suddenly. Officer Martinez looked surprised. That's not typically how we handle these situations. Victim-to-victim contact usually goes through official victim services channels, and there are protocols. Forget the protocols, Maria interrupted, surprising herself with her vehemence. You said she's been nonverbal since the rescue. I was nonverbal for 2 months after I was freed. Sometimes the only person who can reach a trafficking survivor is another trafficking survivor. Maria, I understand your impulse to help, but you're not a trained counselor. Trauma response is complicated, and well-meaning intervention can sometimes make things worse.
And how is the trained counseling working out for her so far?
Officer Martinez paused, clearly considering her point.
Not as well as we'd hoped.
Look, I'm not saying I can fix her or that I should replace professional help.
But I know what it's like to be where she is right now.
I know how it feels to be surrounded by people who want to help but who can't possibly understand what you've been through. Sometimes just knowing that someone else survived can make all the difference.
They were interrupted by a knock on the office door.
A woman in a dark suit peered in, her expression serious. "Dan, sorry to interrupt, but we have a development on the Scottsdale case." Officer Martinez gestured for the woman to enter. "Detective Sarah Kim, this is Maria Rodriguez, the survivor I told you about who's been helping us with the scarification analysis." Detective Kim shook Maria's hand, her grip firm and professional.
"Ms. Rodriguez, your identification of those patterns has been incredibly helpful. We now have confirmation that we're dealing with the same organization, or at least people trained by them." "What's the development?" Officer Martinez asked. "We just arrested 2 more suspects based on intelligence gathered from the Scottsdale house. But, here's the thing, they're claiming they can lead us to a larger operation. Multiple locations, possibly dozens of victims."
Maria felt her heart stop. Dozens of victims meant dozens of people going through what she had experienced, people who might be saved if law enforcement could act quickly enough.
"What do they want in exchange for the information?" Officer Martinez asked.
"Reduced sentences. And they want to talk to someone who's been through the system, someone who can verify their claims about how the organization operates." Both officers turned to look at Maria, and she realized that her decision to help with the investigation had just taken on much larger implications than she had anticipated. "They want to talk to me," she said.
"It wasn't a question. We can't ask you to do that," Detective Kim said quickly. "Talking to suspects is entirely different from looking at photographs.
It would mean facing people who are connected to what happened to you.
But it might save other people." "It might.
Or it might be a waste of time if they're lying to try to get better deals for themselves." Maria stood up from her chair and walked to the window, looking down at the city below. Somewhere out there were people being held against their will, being branded and abused and broken in the same way she had been broken. The suspects in custody might be lying about being able to help, but they also might be telling the truth.
"If I talk to them and they're lying, what happens?"
"Then, we continue investigating through other channels," Detective Kim replied.
"And if they're telling the truth but I don't talk to them?"
"Then, we might miss our chance to rescue people who are counting on us to save them." The choice was clear, even though it was terrifying. Maria had spent 8 years building a life based on avoiding her past, but now her past might be the key to saving other people's futures. "I'll do it," she said, turning back to face the officers.
"But I have conditions." "What kind of conditions?" Officer Martinez asked. "First, I want to talk to the victim from Scottsdale before I talk to the suspects. If I'm going to represent survivor experiences to these people, I want to understand what the current victims are going through."
"That's reasonable," Detective Kim said after a moment's consideration.
"Second, I want full details about the security measures that will be in place when I talk to the suspects. I need to know that I'll be completely safe."
"Absolutely. You'll be in a secure interview room with multiple officers present at all times. And, third, if at any point I want to stop, for any reason, the interview ends immediately. No questions, no pressure to continue."
Both officers nodded their agreement to her terms. "When do we start?" Maria asked. "How about tomorrow morning?"
Detective Kim suggested. "That gives us time to arrange the meeting with the Scottsdale victim and brief you on the security protocols." As Maria prepared to leave the police station, Officer Martinez walked her to the elevator.
"Are you sure about this?"
"Once we start down this path, it's going to be difficult.
You're going to hear details about current cases that might be hard to process."
"I've been carrying the details of my own case for 8 years," Maria replied.
"At least this way, those memories might actually help someone."
That evening, as Maria sat in her apartment preparing for what lay ahead, she realized that her carefully constructed life of hiding and isolation was about to change forever. She was stepping out of the shadows and into a world where her scars would be seen not as marks of shame, but as evidence of survival and strength. For the first time since her rescue, Maria felt like she had a purpose beyond simply existing. The scars that had made her feel marked and damaged might finally serve a purpose greater than her own pain. The Victim Services Center was nothing like the sterile government buildings Maria had expected. Located in a converted house in a quiet residential neighborhood, it looked more like a home than an institution. Detective Kim had explained that this was intentional. Trafficking survivors often responded better to environments that felt safe and domestic rather than official and intimidating. Maria sat in the waiting room, her palms sweating as she prepared to meet another survivor for the first time since her own rescue. Over the years, she had been invited to support groups and survivor meetings, but she had always declined, too afraid of being triggered by other people's stories or having to share her own. "She's agreed to see you," said Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the therapist who had been working with the Scottsdale victim. "But I need you to understand that Lisa, that's the name she's chosen to use for now, hasn't spoken to anyone about her experiences. She's communicated primarily through writing and gestures." "How long has it been since her rescue?" 3 weeks. "She's made some progress in terms of basic trust and self-care, but she's still very fragile." Dr. Hayes led Maria down a hallway lined with artwork created by survivors, paintings and drawings that spoke of pain and hope in equal measure. They stopped outside a door marked simply with a sunflower sticker. "Lisa, this is Maria, the woman I told you about. She's been through something similar to what you experienced." The young woman sitting by the window was thin to the point of frailty, with dark hair that hung in front of her face like a curtain. When she looked up at Maria's entrance, her eyes held the same haunted quality that Maria recognized from her own mirror in the early days of freedom. Lisa's gaze immediately went to Maria's covered arms, and Maria realized that Dr. Hayes had probably told her about the scarification. Without speaking, Lisa slowly rolled up her own sleeve, revealing fresh scars that were still healing, the same geometric patterns that decorated Maria's skin. The recognition between them was instant and profound. Maria had never met another person who bore these specific marks, and seeing them on someone else was both validating and heartbreaking. She was not alone in carrying this particular burden, but that also meant that someone else had endured the same systematic torture. "May I sit down?" Maria asked softly. Lisa nodded and gestured to a chair across from her. Dr. Hayes quietly withdrew to give them privacy but remained within earshot in case intervention became necessary. For several minutes, they sat in silence. Maria understood that rushing to speak would be a mistake. In those first weeks of freedom, she had needed time to simply exist in the presence of others without pressure or expectations. Finally, Lisa spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said you got away too." 8 years ago, Maria replied. "It was a different place, but the same people or people trained by them." "Does it get easier?" The question was simple, but the answer was complex. Maria had spent 8 years learning to live with what had happened to her, building coping mechanisms and finding ways to function in the world. But easier was relative when the baseline was trauma that most people couldn't imagine. "It gets different," Maria said honestly. "Some days are harder than others. But you learn to carry it instead of having it carry you." Lisa touched one of her scars through her sleeve. "They told me I would never be normal again. That I was marked forever." "You are marked forever," Maria said, causing Lisa to look up in surprise. "But that doesn't mean you can't be normal. It just means your normal will be different from other people's normal. How do you hide them when you go out in the world?" Maria realized that Lisa was asking practical questions about survival in a world that would judge her for marks she hadn't chosen to bear. These were concerns that victim services counselors, no matter how well trained, couldn't address from personal experience. Long sleeves, mostly. Makeup for anything that shows. "But, Lisa, I need to tell you something important, hiding them gets exhausting. And it starts to feel like hiding yourself. But people stare. And they judge. Some do. But I've learned that the people worth knowing don't judge you for scars you didn't choose to get." Lisa was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "The police want me to help them catch more people. But I don't want to remember anything about that place." This was the conversation Maria had come here to have, but she realized it was more important than just gathering information for law enforcement. Lisa needed to understand that she had choices, and that whatever decision she made would be respected. "You don't have to help them," Maria said. "Your only job right now is to heal and figure out how to live your life." "But what if there are other people still trapped?" "That's not your responsibility. You didn't create this situation, and you don't have to fix it." "Did you help them?" "When you were rescued." Maria thought about her own experience with law enforcement after her rescue. "I answered their questions because I had to for the court case. But I wasn't ready to do more than that until now." "What changed?" "I realized that my memories might be able to help people who are going through what we went through. But it took me 8 years to get to that point, and you might need more or less time." "There's no timeline you have to follow." Lisa leaned back in her chair, some of the tension leaving her posture. "They make it sound urgent. Like if I don't help right away, people will die." "People in trafficking situations are always at risk, whether you help or not. The urgency isn't your burden to carry." They talked for another hour, with Lisa asking questions about practical aspects of life after rescue. How do you find work when you have no education or employment history? How do you explain gaps in your timeline? How do you learn to trust people again? Maria answered as honestly as she could, sharing both her successes and her failures. She told Lisa about the job she had lost when employers discovered her past, but also about Mrs. Henderson's kindness when the truth came out. She described the isolation she had imposed on herself, but also the recent discovery that some people would stand by her when they learned her story. "The detective said you're going to talk to the people they arrested," Lisa said as their conversation was winding down. "Yes. Tomorrow." "Are you scared?" "Terrified," Maria admitted. "But sometimes the things that scare us are also the things we need to do." "Will you tell me what happens?" "After you talk to them?" "If you want me to." "But only if you want me to." When Maria left the Victim Services Center, she felt drained but also strangely energized. For the first time since her rescue, she had been able to use her experience to help someone else. It felt like the beginning of reclaiming her story, of transforming her survival into something meaningful. That evening, Detective Kim called to confirm the arrangements for the next day's interviews with the suspects. The meeting would take place at the county jail, in a secure conference room with multiple officers present. The suspects would be shackled and separated from Maria by a reinforced table, with additional security personnel stationed outside the room. "We've also arranged for a trauma counselor to be present if you need support," Detective Kim explained. "And remember, you can stop the interview at any time." "What exactly do these people claim they can tell you?" "They say they know the location of an active facility holding approximately 20 victims. They claim it's being run by someone they refer to as the doctor, apparently the person who trains others in the scarification techniques." Maria's blood ran cold. During her captivity, the person who had performed her scarification had been referred to by the same title. She had never known his real name, but she would never forget the clinical precision with which he had carved symbols into her flesh. "I know who that is," she said quietly. "Are you sure?" "The person who marked me was called the doctor. He trained others in the technique." "If it's the same person." Maria paused, remembering the man's cold efficiency and scientific approach to torture. "If it's him, then those 20 victims are in immediate danger." The next morning, Maria arrived at the county jail an hour before the scheduled interview. Officer Martinez was waiting for her in the parking lot, his presence a comforting reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. "How are you holding up?" "I didn't sleep much," Maria admitted. "But I keep thinking about Lisa and the 20 people they claim are being held. That's what's keeping me here." The jail security procedures were extensive: metal detectors, identification checks, and multiple locked doors between the outside world and the interview room. Maria tried to focus on the protective aspects of these measures rather than the way they reminded her of her captivity. The interview room was stark and windowless, with fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh relief. Detective Kim was already there, along with another detective Maria hadn't met and the trauma counselor they had promised to provide. The suspects will be brought in separately, Detective Kim explained. We'll start with the one who claims to have the most information about current operations. When the first suspect was led into the room, Maria's heart nearly stopped. She recognized him immediately, Carlos Mendez, one of the guards from the facility where she had been held. He was older now, his hair graying and his face bearing new lines of stress, but she would never forget those cold eyes. Carlos looked at Maria with obvious recognition and something that might have been fear. "I know you," he said before anyone could speak. "You were at the Arizona facility." "Yes," Maria said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You testified at the trials. Your testimony helped convict half my crew." "Good." Carlos laughed bitterly. "You always were stubborn. Doctor said you'd never break completely." The casual reference to the doctor sent a chill through Maria, but also confirmed what she had suspected. "Where is he now?" "That's what we need to discuss," Detective Kim interjected. "Carlos here claims he can lead us to the doctor's current operation." "Why would you do that?" Maria asked Carlos directly. "Why would you betray him now?" Carlos leaned back in his chair as much as his restraints would allow. "Because I'm looking at 25 to life, and I got kids on the outside. Doctor promised us good money and protection, but he left us all hanging when things went bad. I owe him nothing." "What do you want from me?" Maria asked. "I need you to verify what I tell them. They don't believe me when I describe how the operation worked, how the marking system functioned. But you lived it. You can confirm that I'm telling the truth about the details." Detective Kim opened a thick file folder. "Carlos claims that the doctor is currently operating out of a warehouse complex in South Phoenix. He says there are approximately 20 victims being held there, all marked with the same scarification patterns you're familiar with." "How do you know this?" Maria asked Carlos. "Because I was there 2 weeks ago. Doctor brought me in for a consultation about expanding the marking system. He's been developing new designs, new ways to categorize the merchandise." The casual way he referred to human beings as merchandise made Maria's stomach turn, but she forced herself to focus on the information that might save lives. "Describe the facility," she said. Carlos began talking, describing a layout that was eerily similar to the place where Maria had been held. Multiple holding rooms, a medical area for the scarification procedures, living quarters for guards and handlers. As he spoke, Maria found herself remembering details of her own captivity that she had tried hard to forget. "The medical area," she interrupted. "Does it have stainless steel tables? Surgical lights? Autoclave equipment?" "Yeah, all of that." "How did you know?" "Because I was on those tables. The doctor likes his procedures to be sterile, professional. He thinks it makes him a medical professional instead of a torturer." Detective Kim was taking extensive notes. "Does this match what you remember from your captivity?" "Unfortunately, yes. The setup, the procedures, even the terminology Carlos is using, it's all consistent with what I experienced." They continued for another hour, with Carlos providing details about security measures, daily routines, and the specific location of the facility. Maria verified what she could based on her own experience, while Detective Kim and her colleague planned what was clearly going to be a major raid operation. "There's one more thing," Carlos said as the interview was winding down. "Doctor's planning to move the operation next week. If you're going to hit the place, it has to be soon." After Carlos was taken back to his cell, Maria sat in the interview room feeling emotionally drained. She had just spent 2 hours in close proximity to one of her former captors, reliving details of her trauma in service of helping others. It was both empowering and exhausting. "Are you okay?" Officer Martinez asked. "I will be." "What happens now?" Detective Kim closed her files and looked at Maria with something approaching awe. "Now we plan a raid that's going to save 20 people, thanks to your courage and Carlos's information. The FBI is already mobilizing a task force." "When will it happen?"
Tomorrow night.
These operations require extensive coordination, but we can't wait longer than that if Carlos is right about them moving. The next evening, Maria sat in her apartment watching the news, waiting for reports of the raid. She had asked Detective Kim to call her with updates, but she knew that major operations like this could take hours to unfold.
At 11:30, her phone rang. Maria? It's Detective Kim. I wanted you to know, we got them. 23 victims rescued, including 3 children. And we arrested the doctor.
Maria felt tears streaming down her face before she realized she was crying.
Are the victims okay? They're alive. They'll need extensive medical and psychological care, but they're free. And Maria?
Every single one of them had scarification patterns identical to yours. Your identification of those patterns and your verification of Carlos's information directly led to saving their lives. After the call ended, Maria sat in her living room thinking about the 23 people who would wake up tomorrow in freedom instead of captivity. For 8 years, she had carried the weight of survival guilt, wondering why she had been saved when so many others hadn't been. Tonight, for the first time, she understood that her survival had purpose beyond her own healing. The next week, Maria received a call from Dr. Hayes at the Victim Services Center.
Lisa had asked if she could visit again. She's been talking more since your last conversation, Dr. Hayes explained.
She said meeting you helped her understand that survival was possible. When Maria arrived at the center, she found Lisa sitting in the same chair by the window, but her posture was different, less hunched, less defensive. I heard about the raid on the news, Lisa said without preamble. They said 23 people were rescued.
Yes. Because you helped the police? Because a lot of people worked together. I just provided verification of information. Lisa was quiet for a moment. I want to help too. Not now, but someday. I want to learn how to use what happened to me to help other people. That's a decision you can make when you're ready. And if you're never ready, that's okay too. But you weren't ready for 8 years, and then you were. Maybe I'll be ready sooner.
Looking at Lisa, Maria saw something she hadn't seen during their first meeting: hope.
It was fragile and tentative, but it was there.
And Maria realized that her own healing had reached a new stage.
She was no longer just a survivor carrying her trauma in isolation. She was someone whose survival could light the way for others. Can I ask you something? Lisa said. Do you think the doctor will go to prison forever? I hope so. But even if he doesn't, he can't hurt us anymore. We're not the same people we were when we were captive.
No, Lisa agreed, touching her scarred arm.
We're not.
As Maria left the Victim Services Center that day, she realized that her scars had finally become something other than marks of shame or ownership. They were evidence of survival, proof of strength, and tools for helping others. The people who had marked her body had intended to break her spirit, but, instead, they had created someone who could help heal others. 3 months later, Maria stood before a room full of law enforcement officers, victim services professionals, and fellow survivors, speaking at a conference on human trafficking identification and response. For the first time in 8 years, her sleeves were rolled up, her scars visible to everyone in the room. These marks were meant to dehumanize me, she said, gesturing to her exposed arms. They were meant to make me feel worthless and owned. But, today, they serve as identification for law enforcement, education for service providers, and hope for other survivors. My traffickers wanted to mark me as damaged goods, but, instead, they marked me as a survivor with the power to help others. In the audience, Officer Martinez smiled with pride. Mrs. Henderson had tears in her eyes. And, in the third row, Lisa sat with her own sleeves rolled up, ready to begin her own journey from victim to survivor to advocate. The scars that had once made Maria want to hide from the world had become the very thing that allowed her to step into the light and help others find their way out of the darkness. They would always be part of her story, but now they were also part of other people's stories of survival and hope. The laughter and whispers that had once followed her through courthouse hallways had been replaced by respect and recognition. She was no longer the cleaning lady with mysterious scars. She was Maria Rodriguez, trafficking survivor, victim advocate, and living proof that the human spirit could not be broken, no matter how deeply it was marked.